Something extraordinary happened tonight. And no, this wasn't scheduled chaos or a slow-burning policy debate. This was the kind of political moment that explodes without warning, rattles the capital, and leaves everyone asking the same question at once. How did one decision turn Westminster into a pressure point for an entire nation? Because within minutes of a single announcement, Britain wasn't just reacting, it was responding, loudly, visibly, and without hesitation. What followed was not a routine protest cycle. It was a rapid escalation that exposed tension, mistrust, and political fragility all at once. Here are the 10 defining moments that turned an evening announcement into a nationwide shockwave. The first fault line appeared the moment Prime Minister Keirstarmer publicly welcomed Allah Abdel Fattah back to Britain. This was not framed quietly, nor buried in diplomatic language. It was open, confident, and deliberately symbolic. That symbolism landed badly. Online reactions surged almost instantly, not as scattered criticism, but as concentrated outrage. Millions saw the announcement not as a humanitarian gesture, but as a calculated political signal. The criticism wasn't vague, it was specific, angry, and relentless. People demanded to know why controversial past statements and associations were seemingly brushed aside. Within minutes, social platforms shifted from debate to mobilization. This wasn't passive scrolling, this was digital ignition. And when outrage reaches that intensity that quickly, it rarely stays behind screens. That online fury spilled onto the streets faster than authorities could realistically prepare for. By early evening, crowds began forming outside Parliament, initially small, then rapidly swelling. What made this moment significant wasn't just the size, but the speed. This was not a planned march advertised days in advance. This was spontaneous, reactive, and emotionally charged. London became the focal point, but it didn't stay contained. Birmingham and Manchester followed almost immediately, signaling that the anger resonated far beyond Westminster politics. People weren't arriving with leaflets, they arrived with frustration. The atmosphere was tense but determined, and the scale made one thing obvious. This wasn't about fringe voices, this was mainstream eruption, and it was gathering momentum by the minute. Then came the chants, and with them, the shift in tone. What began as vocal anger sharpened into a direct ultimatum aimed squarely at leadership. Deport now or resign, echoed through Whitehall, unfiltered and unapologetic. That chant mattered because it reframed the protest entirely. This was no longer about scrutinizing one individual's background. It was about accountability at the very top. When crowds chant resignation demands outside Parliament, it signals a breach in public patience. It reflects a belief that normal political channels have failed. The sound carried, bouncing off government buildings, reinforcing the sense that authority itself was being challenged. And once leadership becomes the target, the stakes rise sharply. As pressure intensified, one political voice cut cleanly through the noise. Nigel Farage broke his silence publicly, demanding the revocation of Allah Abdel Fattah's citizenship and immediate deportation. This intervention poured fuel onto an already volatile situation. Within minutes, his statement spread at scale, drawing sharp lines between supporters and critics. What had been a unified protest fractured into opposing camps, now shouting directly at one another. Flags appeared, placards multiplied, accusations flew. Farage's involvement didn't create the unrest, but it undoubtedly accelerated it. By amplifying the controversy, he shifted the narrative from protest to confrontation. At that point, de-escalation became exponentially harder. By mid-evening, containment gave way to control measures. Police deployed riot units as crowds pressed against barriers. Bottles and flares were thrown. Sirens dominated the soundscape. Arrest numbers climbed quickly, and officers were injured while holding lines under sustained pressure. Transport routes through central London were shut down, paralysing the city's core. This wasn't symbolic disruption, it was functional breakdown. When public transport halts and emergency services struggle to move, a city feels the weight of disorder instantly. What made this moment especially concerning was how rapidly protest crossed into confrontation. There was no long transition. The escalation was abrupt, reflecting how emotionally charged the atmosphere had become. Just as the streets reached boiling point, the digital space reignited the fire. Archived screenshots of Abdel Fattah's past statements resurfaced en masse. These weren't new revelations, but their sudden visibility changed everything. Millions viewed compilations of old remarks within hours, many expressing hostility towards British society and political institutions. The timing was devastating. Protesters now felt vindicated in their anger, arguing that crucial information had been withheld or ignored. The debate shifted sharply from policy judgment to trust. People asked why this material hadn't been addressed openly before the welcome. Once trust enters the conversation, the political damage multiplies because it is far harder to contain. Inside Westminster, the response was visibly strained. Several MPs admitted live on air that they had not been fully briefed on Abdel Fattah's background prior to the announcement. That admission hit hard. It suggested disorganization at best and negligence at worst. Emergency meetings were called behind closed doors as pressure mounted across party lines. Opposition figures demanded explanations, while government backbenchers privately acknowledged the fallout was spiraling. This was no longer a communications problem, it was a credibility crisis. When elected officials appear blindsided by major decisions, the public assumes incompetence or concealment. Either interpretation damages authority. As night deepened, the unrest spread geographically and emotionally. Fresh protests emerged in Manchester, Leeds, and Bristol, echoing the same grievances voiced earlier in London. Online, mentions of the Prime Minister surged at unprecedented rates. Calls for resignation multiplied, and petitions gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures within hours. Analysts tracking social platforms recorded extraordinary engagement levels, signaling that the issue had captured national attention. This was no longer a momentary flare-up, it had become a sustained backlash. What unified these reactions was not ideology, but sentiment. People felt ignored, dismissed, and sidelined. That emotional core made the situation far more volatile. By midnight, Britain had entered full political crisis territory. Over 100,000 people had participated in demonstrations or spontaneous gatherings nationwide. Central London remained partially locked down. Police fatigue became a serious concern, prompting reinforcements in multiple cities. Inside Downing Street, silence grew conspicuous. Emergency discussions focused not only on security, but on survival. The phrase "loss of public confidence" appeared repeatedly in official language. That phrase matters because once it gains traction, it signals long-term instability. Governments can survive policy errors. They struggle to survive credibility collapses. As the night edged towards morning, the narrative clarified with brutal simplicity. This was no longer about Alaa Abdel Fattah as an individual, it had become a referendum on leadership, transparency, and accountability. Protesters interviewed on the ground repeated the same sentiment. This wasn't about left or right, it was about trust. Many contrasted the urgency shown in welcoming a controversial figure with the perceived neglect of domestic concerns like crime, borders, and public safety. That contrast fueled resentment across traditional political divides. When anger becomes cross-partisan, it becomes far harder to diffuse. By dawn, the streets quieted, but the damage remained unmistakable. Cleanup crews cleared barriers and debris from Westminster, yet the political fallout lingered heavily. Senior officials conceded privately that the decision had triggered consequences far beyond expectations.
Polling data released overnight showed a sharp drop in approval ratings. Commentators across the spectrum agreed on one point: this moment would not fade quickly. It marked a fracture in public trust that would shape political discourse for months, if not years. Britain had crossed into uncertain territory, and the path forward remained anything but clear. This story is still unfolding, and its outcome will depend entirely on what happens next. If you want sharp updates without spin, stay connected here. Share your view below. Was this mishandled leadership or an unavoidable political storm? Like the video, subscribe for continued coverage, and keep the conversation alive, because moments like this redefine nations.